My presentation probably runs about 35 minutes or so, and I would appreciate it if you just hold off questions till the end, and then I'll be happy to try to answer any questions, concerns, or comments you might have. So if you follow that ground rule, I'll do my best to try to keep you awake. This afternoon, I'm going to speak briefly about Japan's national strategy and alliance politics during the interwar years that preceded the Pearl Harbor attack. Japan's respective military services prepared imperial defense policy independently of each other and without civilian oversight or review. The Imperial Army's continental strategy measured itself against Imperial Russia or the Soviet Union, the northern threat. The Imperial Navy's maritime strategy measured itself against the United States, the southern threat. This contradiction plagued military strategy formulation throughout the interwar era. With that background, in mid-1918, Japanese military authorities revised imperial defense policy to respond to the World War I cataclysm. Imperial Russia was no more, replaced by a revolutionary regime with uncertain prospects. The United States was engaged in a massive naval expansion program that Japan could not hope to match. The revised defense policy posited a future war against a tripartite coalition: the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. The fundamental premise was that Japan would fight a short war, highlighted by decisive battles on land and at sea that would quickly end the conflict. The Army's major initiative would seize Siberia as far west as Lake Baikal. Smaller forces would capture U.S. naval bases in the Philippines. The Navy would eliminate American naval forces in Asian waters and destroy the main U.S. fleet in a decisive main force surface engagement. This required 3 fleets: one to destroy the U.S. Navy in Asian waters, another to convoy Army forces to the Philippines, and a third, the main fleet, for the decisive battle. The problem was Japan had just 2 fleets, and the decision to build a 3rd fleet pitted Japan in a naval arms race against the United States. The immediate post-World War I era witnessed the Versailles Conference dealing not especially well with the collapse of 4 wartime empires, plus the demands of China for suzerainty and Japan for racial equality. In exchange for Japan dropping its equality claims, the major Western powers recognized Japan's rights in China and Tokyo's mandate over Germany's former Pacific Island holdings. The post-war mood of anti-militarism, anti-nationalism, and anti-great power alliances encouraged hopes for international disarmament and collective peaceful solutions to international problems. But in Northeast Asia, Japan faced resurgent Chinese nationalism, renewed commercial competition from Britain and the United States for the China market, and a civil war in Siberia, the last occasioning Japan's Siberian expedition that lasted into 1922. In this new international arena, the cornerstone Anglo-Japanese alliance was not renewed in 1921, and there's no evidence that either the Imperial Japanese Army or the Imperial Japanese Navy strongly resisted the loss of this ally. Fierce commercial rivalry between Japan and Britain in China and differences over naval expansion were more evident than cooperation between the former allies. Moreover, the League of Nations presaged a new international system, relying on multinational treaty agreements, not bilateral alliances. It was in these circumstances that the Washington Naval Conference occurred. Japan could not compete with the United States in the renewed naval race. The Navy's efforts to create a third fleet had already diverted 1/3 of the entire 1921 national budget to the Navy, and the post-war depression left the Japanese cabinet in a retrenchment mode. Although Japan was willing to accept naval limitations, Navy admirals demanded supremacy over a U.S. main fleet in Japanese home waters. To oversimplify the negotiations, American and British admirals believed that because of the great distances involved, a fleet attacking Japan needed a 2-to-1 superiority. That is, the attacking fleet needed twice the strength of the defending fleets. A 10-6 ratio in capital ships would thus limit any U.S. Navy offensive against Japan's home islands. Anti-treaty Japanese admirals, based on earlier staff studies, insisted that the force level needed to win a naval war against the United States required a 10-7 ratio. The 10-6 figure cut the margin of victory too fine. The ultimately agreed upon 10-6 ratio applied only to capital ships. The conference did not establish any limits for auxiliary vessels, particularly heavy cruisers. Japan's admirals then conjectured that if their auxiliaries could reduce an approaching U.S. battle fleet by 10%, Japan's capital ships could annihilate the weakened survivors. Shipbuilding shifted from capital ships to auxiliaries, particularly heavy cruisers, in a new naval arms race. Meanwhile, the Japanese Army, with less than 1/5 of the national budget, struggled with the implications of force modernization in depressed economic times. Personnel reductions paid for modern weapons and equipment. But Army opponents of these 1922 reforms claimed that a large standing army was absolutely necessary in order to win the first battle of the next war, which after all was the key to victory in a short war scenario. Furthermore, the Army could identify no likely opponent. The nascent Soviet Union, the threat from the North, was weak and in turmoil, and China was falling into warlordism. Because the Army lacked a viable opponent, the revised 1923 Imperial Defense Policy identified the United States as a common enemy for both services. This is the only time this happened in the history of the document. Besides being a default opponent, there were legitimate concerns. Washington had criticized Japan's Siberian intervention, insisted on greater commercial rights in Manchuria, imposed naval limitations, and legislated exclusionary immigration policies. The Navy, adapting to its new attrition tactics, shifted the anticipated site of the decisive battle eastward from Japanese home waters to somewhere between the Ryukyus and the Bonins, where battleship divisions would slug it out for naval supremacy in the Western Pacific. To ensure a short, decisive naval war, Japan also had to eliminate U.S. bases on Guam and the Philippines at the opening of any conflict. The 10-6 ratio, however, rendered Japan unable to project its naval offensive power that far into the Western Pacific. Navy hawks demanded a 10-7 ratio. As for the Army, Imperial Defense Policy relegated it to capturing Guam and the Philippines, at most a 3 or 4 division operation. Faced with a depressed economy, declining budgets, and lack of a major opponent, in 1925, the Army inactivated 4 divisions to fund modernization. Within just a few years, however, the military situation in Northeast Asia had dramatically shifted. A stronger Soviet Union was strengthening its military forces in Siberia, while in China, the nationalist unification campaign was moving steadily northward toward Japanese spheres of influence. 2 Japanese military interventions in North China in 1927 and again in 1928, respectively, and a resurgent Soviet military presence in Siberia put pressure on the cabinet to, in our jargon, get boots on the ground to protect Japan's interest in China and Manchuria against irredentist Chinese nationalism, Soviet communism, and American meddling and interference. The Army General Staff now had two threats on the Asian continent, which justified larger forces. Toward the end of the 1920s, the cruiser race fostered an international dispute about further naval arms limitations. The April 1930 London Naval Conference convened to discuss naval disarmament. Although at present ahead in total numbers of heavy cruisers, Tokyo feared that the 1929 U.S. program for cruiser construction would quickly overtake their efforts. The Imperial Navy split over its response. A pro-treaty faction regarded limits as the only way to avoid a protracted war with the United States that Japan could never win. This fundamentally defensive strategy relied on attrition tactics to compensate for an inferior main fleet. It argued that within treaty limitations, the Navy could still control the sea lanes north of the Taiwan Straits by making optimum use of land bases, improved technology, and innovative use of auxiliaries, now including aircraft carriers and submarines. A fleet faction championed by Admiral Suetsugu Nobumasa, the hawkish vice chief of naval operations, foresaw an inevitable clash of cultures between the values of Japan and those of the United States. He insisted on a larger fleet because the 10-7 ratio in offensive striking power underpinned the Navy's short war strategy. The treaty faction dismissed a short war scenario because the then fashionable concept of total war dictated attritional warfare, with Japan adopting the strategic defensive to protect the home islands. The London conference's agreed to 10-6 ratio for heavy cruisers became a bitter pill for the Japanese Navy General Staff to swallow because it forced the Navy to halt construction on heavy cruisers. In the immediate aftermath of the London negotiations, the Japanese press and fleet faction members condemned the agreement as a betrayal of national security because it violated the principle of supreme command vested solely in the military. Ineffective and corrupt politicians had failed to rescue Japan from its deep economic depression and appeared more concerned about petty self-interest than the national polity. This latest controversy weakened the ruling political party and party rule in general. The Naval General Staff pressured the new cabinet to withdraw from the London Treaty. Amidst this growing economic hardship and social unrest, the Army offered its solution: overseas expansion into the wide open spaces of Manchuria. The September 1931 Manchurian incident, a conspiracy engineered by mid-level Army officers, soon led to the takeover of China's 3 northeast provinces and the creation of a new nation of Manchukuo. Despite, or because of, international criticism by the Western powers, Japanese public opinion enthusiastically supported the Army's unilateral action as a much-needed corrective for weak-kneed diplomats, corrupt politicians, and ineffective bureaucrats. Soon after the incident, Manchuria, Japan's lifeline, entered the popular lexicon. It was shorthand to mean that with Manchuria's natural resources, Japan was no longer helpless against Western bullying. Some Japanese viewed themselves as Asia's champion against Anglo-Saxon domination. Colonel Ishiwara Kanji, the Army's mastermind of the 1931 Manchurian incident, wrote and lectured on the final decisive war between Japan, champion of Asia, and the United States, the paladin of the West, which he expected to occur sometime around 1950. When the League of Nations formally condemned Japan's use of military force in Manchuria in early 1933, Japanese representatives walked out of the League in protest. Matsuoka Yosuke, Tokyo's flamboyant League representative, led the dramatic departure captured forever on film. But Matsuoka never intended to leave the League or to resort to crisis diplomacy. Matsuoka had advised Tokyo that while small nations might be sympathetic towards China, the big powers didn't want to alienate Japan. He counseled conciliation. The foreign minister, playing to domestic opinion, opted for confrontation. Even if the country is turned into scorched earth, he had previously declared, it will not shake our recognition of Manchukuo. In truth, the National Unity's cabinet fixation over recognition of Manchukuo drove policy. Matsuoka's walkout from the League, the status of Manchukuo, further army meddling in North China, and the possibility of another naval arms race left Japan increasingly adrift in the international arena. Manchukuo was also essential for Colonel Ishiwata's preparations for the final war. The Japanese army carved out buffer zones in North China to shield Manchukuo, and along Manchukuo's borders carefully monitored the Soviet Red Army's steady deployments, expected to peak in 1936. The Imperial Navy would also enter the non-treaty era in 1936. This crisis of 36 mentality infected the fleet faction, which insisted on a larger navy in order to control the South China Sea. They proposed now to eliminate American bases in the Philippines by extending the decisive fleet engagement east of the Philippines. Facing the non-treaty era, even the moderate treaty faction backed a naval buildup, fearing that otherwise the Army would get too large of a budget share. While the Navy required a buildup against the Americans, the Soviets' continuing reinforcement of the Soviet Far East mandated an Army buildup. In these circumstances, Ishiwata met with his Navy counterpart to discuss the requirements for a future war. Would it be a short war or a protracted war? Who would the likely opponents be? And what would be the direction of Japan's strategic advance, north or south? Army strategists envisioned a protracted ground war in Northeast Asia that necessitated immediate preparations. Initial operations would quickly take out Soviet air power in eastern Siberia, enabling ground forces to destroy Soviet units east of Lake Baikal. In this scenario, the Navy's marginal role would be to assist the Army in seizing Vladivostok. The Navy identified the United States as the major threat and envisioned a short, decisive naval campaign. The Army's marginal role would be to seize the Philippines. A triad of battleships, carriers, and land-based naval aircraft would weaken and ultimately destroy the approaching U.S. battle fleet in waters east of Luzon, Philippines. The emphasis was on battleships, and big gun proponents in the Navy cheered when the keels of the super battleships Yamato and Musashi were laid in 1937. Put differently, the Army would advance north against the Soviet Union and defend the South. The Navy would defend the North and advance south against the Americans. Both services were intent not only on expanding force structure, but also on implementing enormously expensive programs to modernize weapons and equipment. The 1936 version of imperial defense policy was supposed to resolve these contradictory military strategies. Instead, the service-oriented continental and maritime strategies emerged intact. The June 1936 revision to imperial defense policy had something for everyone. It stated that the objective was a short war, but allowed the conflict could become protracted. The main enemies were the United States and the Soviet Union, but they might also include China and Great Britain. Despite acknowledging the possibility of fighting against a coalition, the respective services continued to gauge their requirements against their two primary and different opponents, In other words, defining strategy in terms of operational planning. A few weeks later, the Army issued its national military policy to modernize the force in order to drive Western influence from Asia. The defeat of the Soviet Union would be the first step. This became the basis for an expensive 5-year rearmament plan to overhaul the Army for war with the Soviet Union, then expected to occur in 1942. The very same day, the Five Ministers' Conference endorsed the Navy's southward advance strategy, in effect justifying a massive naval rearmament program to be completed in early 1942. That August, the Foreign Ministry approved Fundamentals of National Policy, a diplomacy designed to neutralize the Soviet Union, underwrite a peaceful advance into Asia's southern regions, strengthen the Army in Manchuria to win the first battle of the next war, and expand the Navy to control the Western Pacific. It also gave the green light for Anti-Comintern Pact negotiations with Nazi Germany in order to deprive China of a major foreign ally. In October 1936, the Cabinet approved the Anti-Comintern Pact concluded between Japan and Germany. Tokyo's original intention was to create a broad network of nations to contain the Soviet Union while freeing Japan from its diplomatic isolation. Japanese diplomats sought to enlist British, Dutch, and Italian participation in this scheme, and they also discussed the encirclement idea with Polish and other ambassadors. When nothing came of these overtures, the foreign minister questioned the wisdom of even having a bilateral pact with Germany. Army leaders were lukewarm about the pact and finally agreed to it provided it was not a military alliance with automatic protocols. The foreign ministry again highlighted that the pact would deprive China of German military assistance. In the larger context, this pact, for which there was little Japanese enthusiasm, backfired because it identified Japan with Nazi Germany, increasing Tokyo's estrangement from the other major Western powers, especially the United States. The outbreak of the undeclared Sino-Japanese War in July 1937 threw the previous year's strategic and diplomatic compromises into disarray. The Army's rampage through China turned world opinion against Japan, leaving the nation even more isolated. As the war expanded, the Army occupied Guangzhou in South China in October 1938. The Navy promptly pressured the government for approval to seize Hainan Island, ostensibly to close the southern end of the China blockade, but actually to control the South China Sea, neutralize the Philippines, and ultimately as a base to project naval power beyond the Philippines and into the Western Pacific. In September 1939, Europe went to war. And 2 months later, the Naval General Staff requested permission to start the first stage of fleet mobilization aimed at doubling its personnel by late 1941. By this time, the Army had 1.2 million men under arms, the majority deployed in Manchukuo or on the fighting fronts of China. Army leaders still remained committed to a war with the Soviets, regardless of their sobering defeat by the Red Army at Nomonhan, Helkengol in the summer of 1939, accompanied by erstwhile allies Germany's duplicitous signing of a non-aggression pact with the Soviets in the midst of the Nomonhan fighting. Army leaders also wanted to end the war in China, but not at any price. In late March 1940, strategists decided that if military force could not resolve the China incident during 1940, then the following year Tokyo would commence large-scale troop withdrawals from China. Within 2 years, Japan would consolidate forces in a large triangular area bordered by Shanghai, stretching into North China and encompassing Manchukuo. The Nazi victories in France and the Low Countries during May and June 1940 seemingly offered Japan a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to isolate China from Western aid running through Burma and French Indochina. The European colonies in Asia were also isolated and ripe for the picking, like rice cakes off the shelf. The catchphrase, "Don't miss the bus," summed up the urgency to take advantage of this opportunity. Imperial General Headquarters War Diary recorded the enthusiasm for a Southern advance that marked a 180-degree turn in the Army's strategic thinking. In late July, Prime Minister Konoye Fumimaro announced the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere to create a new order in East Asia to end American and British domination of the region. Washington equated it to the Nazis' New Order, with all the odious implications that carried. The next day, an Imperial Headquarters Liaison Conference agreed to settle the China incident quickly and, if the opportunity presented itself, simultaneously resolve issues in the southern regions. The strategy hinged on preventing outside aid from reaching the Chongqing government, which in turn would cause China's collapse. Occupying French military bases in French Indochina would deter the British from further assistance and prevent United States interference in the region. It would also provide operating bases to prepare for a southern advance. Both services sought to exploit the opportunities presented by the Nazi triumphs in Europe to create self-sufficient zones in Asia, the so-called southern region. The Army was willing to use force to occupy the region and then use its resources to prepare for war against either the United States or the Soviet Union. The Navy, however, favored a peaceful expansion, likely the results of war games played against the United States in mid-May 1940 that ended with the Navy unable to protect the sea lanes leading back to Japan. Navy Minister Admiral Yoshida Zengo concluded that it was pointless to attack the Netherlands East Indies because their resources could not be transported safely intact back to the home islands. Still, if it was necessary, the fleet was prepared to use force, and on the 20th of June, the Naval General Staff began detailed contingency planning for a southern advance. In late August 1940, the Army General Staff began drafting plans for a Malaya operation as part of an overall campaign that also included the Philippines and the Netherlands East Indies. Meanwhile, the British, under German air bombardment and threat of invasion, gave in to Japanese pressure and closed the Burma Road in July 1940. Franco-Japanese discussions over basing rights in French Indochina went nowhere, and on the 23rd of September, Japanese troops occupied northern Indochina. The Army's thinking, in other words, had shifted from ending the China War quickly so they could advance south to moving south to end the China War quickly. No one had seriously considered the Western reaction. The United States embargoed scrap metal shipments to Japan. In October, the British reopened the Burma Road. Once again, Japanese aggression produced unanticipated reactions. Adding to Tokyo's isolation, 4 days after Japanese troops entered French Indochina, now Foreign Minister Matsuoka signed the Tripartite Pact in Berlin. Prime Minister Konoye's original concept was to prevent the United States from entering a war against Japan while maintaining neutral relations with the Soviet Union, in effect defending the North and advancing south. Matsuoka had hoped to enlist the Soviet Union in a four-power commercial pact, but by this time relations between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had worsened, making this impossible. Within the Japanese Navy, political maneuvering promoted a new Navy minister sympathetic to the pact, swayed further by promises of larger budgets, as well as assurances that the pact had no automatic participation clause in case of a German-American war. The Tripartite Pact was clearly aimed at the United States. Berlin's purpose was to use the threat of a two-ocean war to prevent America from entering the war against Germany. When asked about American economic retaliation, Matsuoka acknowledged that Japanese-American relations were very bad, yet he argued that they could not be restored by caving in to the demands of the United States. He believed that signing the pact would display Japan's determined resolution, isolate the United States, and deter Washington from war. Of course, it produced the opposite reaction, which he never expected. The pact further antagonized the United States which after all supplied the bulk of the Japanese Navy's strategic materials, as well as it tied Japan to allies thousands of miles away that had resource requirements of their own. Thus, the fall of 1940 finds Japan more isolated internationally. Germany had failed to defeat Great Britain, and Tokyo's year-long peace overture to the Chongqing government had failed, leaving the China War no closer to its solution. Internally, the Army was divided over future strategy. The General Staff's Operation Division sought simultaneous preparations for war either north or south. The War Ministry's Military Affairs Bureau wanted to move south. In mid-October 1940, the Navy ordered the second stage mobilization to begin, with full mobilization to be completed by mid-November 1941. Furthermore, Japanese strategists determined in late 1940 that the Japanese fleet probably could not await the approaching American fleet. With uncertainty about the Americans risking a crossing through the Mandates, the decisive battle would now be fought far into the Western Pacific, somewhere in the vicinity of the Marianas or the Carolines. As the services modified these strategic and operational plans, Konoye and Matsuoka in early 1941 considered adding the Soviet Union to the Tripartite Pact. Soviet participation would end Moscow's military assistance to China, providing Japan with leverage to end that war and strengthen Tokyo's hand against the United States and Great Britain. The Germans were not interested. Instead, Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop railed to Matsuoka that if the USSR is not smashed, the root of all evil will not be removed from Europe. It can't get much clearer. He also harangued Matsuoka to immediately attack Singapore. While Matsuoka was in Berlin, Germany invaded the Balkans. Matsuoka thought this action would force the Soviet Union to stabilize its relations with Japan to avoid an Eastern threat so that Moscow could coordinate its energies in the West. Accordingly, Matsuoka next traveled to Moscow, where a last-minute and unexpected intervention by Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin led to the signing of the Neutrality Pact on the 13th of April. Matsuoka believed that securing Japan's northern flank improved its negotiating position with the United States. But Washington, of course, regarded it as yet another example of Japan's preparations to move into Southeast Asia. This was an interpretation, incidentally, endorsed by the Imperial General Headquarters War Diary. 2 months later, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, throwing Japanese military strategy and diplomacy into consternation. The Army was divided. The Operations Division demanded an immediate strike north, but others took a wait-and-see attitude, willing to attack only if the USSR appeared to be in danger of imminent collapse. Preparations went forward to advance north or south. A secret and massive mobilization ultimately marshaled more than 750,000 Japanese troops in Manchukuo, poised to invade the Soviet Union. The Navy simultaneously saw its chance to move south. A 2 July 1941 Imperial Conference endorsed the advance south, even at the risk of war with Great Britain and the United States, but with the inevitable caveat that favorable conditions might allow for a northern advance. 2 weeks later, Imperial General Headquarters ordered 25th Army in South China to occupy southern Indochina. Japanese forces moved in on the 23rd of July, and to the surprise of Japanese planners who predicted the occupation would not provoke a drastic American reaction, the United States promptly froze Japanese assets. About a week later, the United States embargoed the export of oil to Japan. On the northern front, by late July, the expected large-scale withdrawals of Soviet units from the Far East to fight the Nazis had not materialized, and constrained by a very tight operational timetable for the attack on the Soviet Union, on the 9th of August, the Army shifted its operational planning to a southern advance. Plans were to be complete by October 1941, 1 month before the anticipated opening of hostilities. A 5-day joint planning session opened on 20 September. The Army wanted to attack Singapore first. The Navy wanted to strike the Philippines first. then the Netherlands, East Indies, and Malaya last. A compromise approved near simultaneous attacks on Malaya and the Philippines, plus the release of 2 new carriers to support southern operations, which was an Army demand. Following this agreement, naval authorities approved Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku's Pearl Harbor operation, a completely separate and restricted planning effort of which Army planners were completely unaware. On the 8th of November, the respective chiefs of staff briefed Emperor Hirohito for the first time about the Pearl Harbor attack, and 1 week later, Hirohito was shown the full war plan with all of its details. The Emperor, as requested by the Navy, approved the Pearl Harbor operation on the 19th of November. To conclude, I was going to pontificate about the failure of Japan's interwar security and diplomatic efforts. There was no strategic military consensus, and the Washington Treaty was the only pact that had any positive benefits for Japan. But then I started to think about it. Were Tokyo's policies any more disjointed than the other great powers? The pre-war old order had collapsed, ushering in a tumultuous interwar period characterized by dramatic and continual global shifts in national security policies, international relations, military affairs, ideologies, and weapons development. Consider Britain's 10-year rule, or its haphazard approach to the construction of Fortress Singapore, the supposed linchpin of London's military strategy in Asia, and appeasement diplomacy. Did American isolationism, anti-Japanese racism, and economic protectionism promote international stability? The Soviet Union's expedient neutralism opened the gates for war in Europe. And Nazi Germany, the destabilizing continental power since the mid-1930s, took full advantage. If we look at it maybe in this larger context, then perhaps Japan's interwar diplomatic and military strategies were about all that could be expected. Thank you for listening to me. And I will answer your questions. Sir.
Thank you very much. At the beginning, you talked about the Japanese going to Lake Baikal.
Yep.
If they went to Soviet Union, which is, I guess, in what universe would they have had the logistics to do that? And more broadly, I take your point that everybody in the 30s had weird strategies, but the Japanese, and frankly, the Italians didn't have the economic strength to do any of this. There's no military plan they come up with in the late 30s that they have the resources to do, whether going to war against the Soviet Union, going to war against the United States. At what point does anybody stand up and say, this is insane?
Well, it wasn't insane. The point was we have the natural resources of Manchuria, and we are rapidly converting to heavy industry in the home islands. That was what the whole inflationary government spending program was about. They were converting to an industrial base. They didn't have one, but they expected by 1942, with the new Zaibatsu building in Manchuria and the old Zaibatsu concentrated in the home islands, they would have an industrial infrastructure. They were not planning to occupy all of that area. They're planning to cut the Trans-Siberian Railroad, eliminate Soviet Union units, and have advanced detachments get to Lake Baikal. Their major emphasis was on the Primorsky Krai. They wanted Vladivostok. They wanted to knock that out. The other operations were ancillary to cut the line of communication. You know, I mean, it's much like the Russo-Japanese War. So it may have been fanciful, but it wasn't insane. And the other problem is, as decent planners, they had to work with what they had. They couldn't make up things, but they did believe that, based on their assessment of the Red Army and the Soviet Far East, they believed that this could be done. Okay? Sir?
I think very your quick comments there. I think the United States, too rarely we ask the question, we focus on the mistakes and bad choices Japan made, but I think you could argue that the United States woefully misunderstood what would happen when they took the steel oil embargo on as well. So, there were mistakes.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. No, if you look at one nation discreetly, it's easy to pick and say, oh, bad idea, good idea. But when you see what they're up against and how they're trying to react to the international dynamics of I mean, a period that makes what, to use a poor analogy, like post 9/11 in the United States, and throughout the world for that matter, a period of great instability, enormous technological change, shifting alliances and the like. This is what they faced in the 30s, constantly. And of course, weapons development, which they were all cognizant of. So I agree, if you take a look at the broader context, everyone made mistakes. And it wasn't a rush to war, it was just incremental. You know, you take a step forward based on the theory that, well, I can always take a step back, but you can't. You've done something, you made a commitment, and this in turn has provoked a reaction or a commitment of someone else. I think I'm agreeing with you. See. I don't think the oil embargo per se, I don't think necessarily accelerated the plans. They were working on an operational deadline for late November, early December, both services, more for really weather-related considerations. If they waited till January, they couldn't go anywhere in Southeast Asia. But what happened was with the attack on Pearl Harbor, when it knocked out the main battle fleet, the Japanese had freedom of action throughout the Western Pacific, into the Indian Ocean and into the Netherlands East Indies. So that, I mean, at that point, they didn't have to worry about getting the oil back or anything else. And I think recently, some NHK program where they, you know how they published the book later, they said the question the Japanese asked themselves in the 50s was, why did they go to war with no resources? Well, the answer today is they went to war to get the resources. So, you know, but, you know, they had that window of opportunity, they took it.
Concentrating first about the Imperial Japanese Navy on a short war and a decisive battle. Was that based on expediency or war games, or was it from Tsushima?
All of the above. But I mean, certainly Tsushima always figured prominently in Japanese naval strategic thought, that how do you get the enemy to approach you and then destroy the main fleet, and then you get a quick solution. Now, as we know, that Japan was in serious trouble and the Russians really could have cleaned their clocks in Manchuria if that war progressed, and it was really thanks to Theodore Roosevelt and the Portsmouth Conference that was able to negotiate a settlement. But in Japanese lore, Tsushima was a decisive naval battle and swung the whole balance of the conflict. So, you know, there was that, but and then that in turn became the basis for the 1907 plans, which insisted on a larger fleet to destroy the American fleet in home waters. So, I mean, these ideas were always swirling around within the Japanese Navy's intellectual firmament. It was not something new. Okay?
Going back to the earlier part of the discussion, some of the questions over here, Japanese mentality, the psyche of Japan, post-World War I, leading up to your comment about seemingly equality in the state.
Well, you know, you have Woodrow Wilson, of course, announcing his, 14 points of whatever. And, I mean, this is a very idealistic expression of a new world, to a new remade world. Yet, when it comes to Versailles, it's pretty clear this isn't going to happen, mainly because the Australians don't want it to happen. They don't want the yellow peril coming down. And Australia in particular is very blunt about their desires. So the Japanese are willing to accept that there will not be a racial equality clause announced at Versailles in exchange for, commercial rights in China. And, you can call it a cynical decision, but on the other hand, they weren't going to get it. So you might as well get something out of a bad bargain, and I think that's what they achieved. Racism was sometimes used to stir up the population, but not often. The popular press had lots of other things to excite people about. Well, yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, the Japanese were always conscious of an inferior status vis-a-vis whites, but especially the West. And this is why you have, people like Suetsugu talking about this clash of values. I mean, Ishiwara Kanji's book, The Great Final War, basically it's a treatise on how the West has discriminated against and bullied Japan, and now is the time to stand up. And this had tremendous appeal. But when the Japanese got involved in China, and in 1937 it was not planned. It escalated out of control for a number of reasons. I'd be happy to talk to you about those later. But the Japanese were always queasy. The Japanese civilian population was always queasy about what was going on in Asia. Why are Asians fighting Asians? Now, I mean, you don't find this in a newspaper, but there's always that subtext. Pearl Harbor Day, Japanese intellectuals are confiding to their diaries, "This is the greatest day of my life. We've thrown off the Western beast." And these are from people who are otherwise we would certainly regard as leftists, pacifists. Steve, I don't know, maybe even communists, but I mean, they were just overjoyed because we're finally going after these Western devils who have treated us so badly and lorded it over us. And of course, the Japanese then in turn, when they went into China, Netherlands, East Indies, Malaya, they did the same thing to the indigenous peoples. They just said, "Who are you?" And couldn't figure out why their occupation policies weren't a success. But yeah, thank you. It's a good point. Mike. Sure.
Somewhere in the same area. Why wasn't the Japanese or the Germans also more coordinated in actually developing a Eastern strategy or Far Eastern strategy? Ultimately, the strategic sense, they could keep the Far Eastern Red Army in place, could help take off a major player of the chessboard for the Axis power.
Basically, they didn't trust each other. The Nazis, more for racial reasons, the Japanese, because they knew the Nazis were racists. And the Japanese Navy, the Japanese Navy in particular, never trusted the Nazis. The Army exploited technology, particularly aviation technology, but the Germans were always at an arm's length, and then they double-crossed them, of course, at Nomonhan. And the only place where they really coordinated was in diplomacy. I mean, the Tripartite Pact, Italy, Nazi Germany and Japan. You know where it was negotiated?
Well, even if they were discussing.
No, but do you know where it was negotiated? The Germans sent a special envoy to Tokyo to negotiate directly with the foreign minister because they didn't trust the Japanese ambassador in Berlin to convey their meanings. They didn't even, and what they do is they get notes from Italy, which they forward to Tokyo. And then they go back to Berlin and sign the pact. I mean, it was crazy. But there was just no confidence. And the Germans wanted the Japanese Navy because they thought that would get the British out and probably keep the Americans at bay. Otherwise, they could have cared less. And the more the Japanese thought about it, what could the Germans do for them? You know, they had a non-aggression pact with the Soviets, and then they broke that. Well, maybe we can do something. But even there, the Germans didn't do it. Yeah, but they just didn't talk. I mean, it's one thing for von Ribbentrop to say, go take Singapore, but he's not telling them, by the way, in another 6 weeks, we're going against Moscow.
The other part of the answer is stay tuned for the final two presentations.
Yeah. Okay.